The entire courtroom bursts into laughter as a racist judge mocks a black teenager, thinking he's just another lost kid. But when the teen opens his mouth, the laughter dies instantly. The judge's smug grin fades, his face turns pale. Because the truth about this teenager is about to shake the entire courtroom, and his career, to its core. And when you find out who he really is, you'll be absolutely shocked. The air inside the courtroom was suffocating. Every eye in the room locked onto the teenage boy standing near the defense table. He felt the weight of their stares, some filled with curiosity, others with amusement. But the worst? The judge's eyes. Cold, condescending, and dripping with something the young man knew all too well: racism. He had faced it before. In classrooms where teachers doubted his abilities. In grocery stores where security guards trailed him like a shadow. On sidewalks where strangers clutched their purses a little tighter as he passed. But this was different. This was a courtroom, a place where justice was supposed to be blind, where the law was meant to protect, not belittle. But as the judge leaned forward, smirking, it was clear. Justice wasn't blind today. It was staring directly at him, and it was laughing. The judge's voice cut through the room, condescending and sharp. "So, what do we have here? Another troubled youth trying to play smart?" He chuckled, shaking his head. The courtroom erupted in laughter, echoing off the walls. The teen's grip tightened around the papers in his hands. His heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let his face betray him. He had worked too hard to be standing here, spent years studying, fighting against every label, every statistic, every whispered doubt, but none of that mattered to the man in the black robe. To him, he was just another black kid, another case, another statistic, another name to dismiss. The laughter faded, but the judge wasn't done. He leaned back, tapping his gavel against the bench lazily. "Let me guess. You're here to ask for mercy." His voice dripped with amusement. "Maybe tell me some sob story about how you're turning your life around. You kids never learn." A few chuckles rippled through the audience. Some of the jurors even smirked. The bailiff, standing stiffly at the side, avoided eye contact. No one spoke up. No one told the judge to stop. The teen exhaled slowly, steadying himself. This was the moment. He took a single step forward, lifted his chin, and with a voice clear, firm, and unwavering, he finally spoke. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I am not the defendant. I am the defense attorney." And in an instant, the room that had been filled with laughter fell into a dead, stunned silence. For the first time since the teenager had stepped into the courtroom, there was no laughter, no smirks, no condescending chuckles from the jury, just silence. The judge's face, once filled with smug amusement, froze mid-smirk. His fingers, which had been lazily tapping the gavel against the bench, stiffened. His eyes narrowed, confusion flickering across his face, like he couldn't quite process what had just been said. "Excuse me?" The judge leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter now. "What did you just say?" The young man swallowed back the frustration burning in his chest. He had spent years preparing for this moment, but he had never expected to be humiliated before he could even speak. He had worked harder than anyone, pushed past every obstacle thrown his way. And yet, the moment he stood in front of a judge, his skin color spoke before he did. But now it was his turn to speak. He squared his shoulders, met the judge's stunned gaze, and repeated himself. "I said, Your Honor, I am the defense attorney." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The jurors exchanged glances, some in disbelief, others in embarrassment. The prosecutor, who had been flipping through files absent-mindedly, snapped his head up so fast it looked like he had been jolted awake. The bailiff, who had stood still this entire time, finally shifted uncomfortably. But it was the judge's reaction that held the most weight. His face, which had gone pale, slowly flushed red. His lips pressed into a tight, thin line. "Is this some kind of joke?" His voice was quieter now, almost as if he didn't want to believe what he was hearing. The teenager did not blink. "No, Your Honor. I am fully licensed to practice law. I passed the bar at 14. I am here today as legal counsel for my client." The courtroom erupted again, but this time, not with laughter, with pure, stunned disbelief. Gasps filled the air. A woman in the audience covered her mouth with her hands. One of the jurors audibly muttered, "No way." The prosecutor's eyes darted between the judge and the young lawyer, as if waiting for someone to confirm this was some elaborate prank, but it wasn't. And deep down, the judge knew it. He blinked, his mouth opening slightly before closing again. For the first time in a long time, he had no words. He had been so sure, so certain that this black teenager was nothing more than another troubled kid, that he was here begging for mercy, or worse, trying to con the system. But now the power dynamic had shifted. Now, the very person he had mocked was standing before him as an equal. The judge's fingers twitched around his gavel. He cleared his throat, as if trying to regain control of the room. But it was already too late, because everyone had seen it. Everyone had witnessed the moment his arrogance turned into humiliation, and the young attorney, he just stood there waiting, unbothered, unshaken, unapologetic, because he had come here to fight for justice, and nothing, not even a racist judge's disbelief, was going to stop him. The judge gripped his gavel, his knuckles turning white. He had lost control of the courtroom, and he knew it. The same people who had laughed just moments ago now sat in stunned silence, whispering among themselves. Their amusement had turned to embarrassment. But more than that, it had turned to respect. And the judge hated that. His authority had never been questioned like this before, especially not by a black teenager, especially not by someone he had mocked, belittled, and dismissed before even learning his name. The young attorney stood tall, completely unshaken, his presence demanding attention. He had nothing to prove anymore, because the truth had already shattered every assumption in the room. The judge cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Mr. What's your name?" His voice was stiff now, forced, like the words burned his tongue. The young man didn't hesitate. "Isaiah Williams, Your Honor." Isaiah, the name of the very person he had just humiliated in front of an entire courtroom. The judge exhaled sharply, flipping through the case file, pretending to read something. But everyone knew what he was doing. He was buying time, trying to process how he had just made a fool of himself. After a moment, he finally looked back up. But this time, the smug arrogance was gone. Now, there was something else in his eyes. A flicker of something Isaiah had seen before. Fear. Because now the judge wasn't just looking at a teenager. He wasn't just looking at a young black man he could dismiss. He was looking at a lawyer who was smart, prepared, and, most dangerous of all, undeniably legitimate. And that terrified him. "Well then, Mr. Williams." The judge forced a dry chuckle, but it was awkward, hollow. He shifted in his seat. "I suppose we should get started then." Isaiah nodded once, his expression calm, controlled. He had already won his first battle today, not with anger, not with outbursts, but with something far more powerful, with the truth. And as he turned to face his client, adjusting his suit with quiet confidence, one thing became clear. He wasn't here to impress. He wasn't here to seek validation. He was here to win. Isaiah turned to his client, a middle-aged black man with tired eyes and a slumped posture. A man who had spent months, maybe even years, being silenced, ignored, and tossed around by a system that was never built to protect him. But today, he had a voice, and that voice belonged to Isaiah Williams. Isaiah smoothed the papers on the table, feeling the weight of the moment. This was not just about proving himself. This was about justice. And as much as the judge wanted to pretend this was just another case, Isaiah knew better. Because deep down, the judge was scared. Not just because he had humiliated himself, not just because his prejudice had been exposed, but because now he had to take Isaiah seriously. "Your Honor," Isaiah began, his voice steady, firm, "I'd like to begin with a motion to dismiss the charges against my client." The judge blinked. "Excuse me?" Isaiah didn't waver. "The charges are baseless. My client was arrested on false pretenses, with no credible evidence. The police report contradicts itself, and the officer's statement is riddled with inconsistencies." He held up a document, tapping the paper lightly. "This is not justice, Your Honor. This is racial profiling." A ripple of tension moved through the courtroom. Even the prosecutor shifted in his seat, his face suddenly uncomfortable. The judge opened his mouth, but no words came out. Because Isaiah was right. And the worst part, he knew it. For years he had seen cases like this. Cases where black men were arrested, not because of evidence, but because of assumptions. Cases where the accused had no real defense because they couldn't afford one. Cases where men like Isaiah's client were swallowed whole by the system before they ever had a chance to fight back. But today, that was not going to happen. Isaiah watched the judge's face carefully. He could see the internal battle, the struggle between pride and reality, the desire to put Isaiah in his place, to dismiss him, to brush him off like he had done minutes ago. But now the entire courtroom was watching. And if the judge made the wrong call, if he ignored the facts after already embarrassing himself once, his reputation would crumble. So instead, he let out a sharp breath and adjusted his robe. His face remained unreadable, but his voice was noticeably strained when he spoke. "I'll review the motion." Isaiah nodded, his face calm, but inside. He knew what had just happened. The judge had no choice but to take him seriously. And for the first time, Isaiah realized something powerful. This wasn't just about today. This was the beginning of something much bigger. Isaiah didn't move as the judge flipped through the documents, his eyes scanning the pages with a forced sense of control. The entire courtroom was still, every person waiting for what would come next. But Isaiah already knew. He had shaken the foundation of this room. Because now, the system had to answer to him. The judge exhaled sharply, setting the papers down. His fingers twitched against the bench. He was trapped. If he denied the motion without reason, it would expose him even further. But if he approved it, he'd be admitting, in front of an entire courtroom, that Isaiah Williams, the black teenager he mocked, was right. And that was a pill too bitter to swallow. So instead, the judge stalled. "Mr. Williams," he began, his voice slow, measured. "You're making some bold accusations. Racial profiling is a serious claim." Isaiah lifted his chin slightly. "Because it's a serious issue, Your Honor." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The judge's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged. Not like this. Not by someone half his age, someone he had dismissed the moment he walked in. And Isaiah could see it. The panic creeping in behind his mask of authority. The prosecutor shifted in his seat, adjusting his tie. Even he knew this wasn't going well. If he went after Isaiah's client now, he'd be pushing against a case that was already crumbling. The judge tapped his fingers on the bench, his mind racing. He needed a way out, a way to regain control, a way to make Isaiah small again. So he tried. "You are very passionate, Mr. Williams." The words were slow, forced, like he was picking each one carefully. "But passion does not equal experience. You may have a license, but you lack the years to truly understand the law." Isaiah didn't flinch. Because this was the moment he had been preparing for his entire life. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Isaiah said, his voice unwavering. "If the law is based on experience rather than truth, then justice is nothing more than a privilege for the powerful." Silence. Heavy, unshakable. The judge's lips parted slightly, but nothing came out. The entire courtroom was staring at him now, waiting, watching. Isaiah could feel it. The shift, the power that had once belonged to the judge, to the system, was slipping. Because no matter what the judge said next, he had already lost. And Isaiah, he had just changed the game forever. For the first time, the judge had no comeback, no sarcastic remark, no dismissive wave of his hand. Isaiah's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, pressing down on the judge, on the prosecutor, on every single person in that room who had once laughed at him. Justice is nothing more than a privilege for the powerful. No one had ever dared to say that out loud in his courtroom. And now, a black teenager had said it with such undeniable truth that even the walls seemed to absorb the weight of it. The judge's face twitched. He glanced at the jury, at the people in the gallery, at the prosecutor, as if looking for someone, anyone, to break the tension. But there was nothing, because everyone could see what had happened. Isaiah had come in as a joke, a moment of entertainment for the court to mock, to dismiss, to belittle. But now Now, he was the one in control. The judge cleared his throat, sitting up straighter, grasping at whatever authority he had left. "Mr. Williams," his voice was tight, forced. "The law is complex. It is not something that can be reduced to emotional appeals." Isaiah tilted his head slightly. The condescension was still there, but weaker now. The judge was on unstable ground, and they both knew it. "Then let's focus on the law," Isaiah said smoothly. He flipped through his papers, landing on a highlighted section. According to precedent set in Johnson versus State, racial profiling is grounds for immediate dismissal when there is clear evidence of bias. He slid the document across the table toward the judge. "I believe Exhibit C shows just that." The prosecutor tensed. The judge's jaw tightened. Because Isaiah had just done something dangerous. He had used their own system against them, and now the judge was left with two choices: deny the motion and risk exposing himself even further, or grant it and set a precedent that would hold weight beyond this case. Either way, he had already lost. The courtroom was dead silent, everyone waiting for his response. The judge's fingers curled around his gavel. He exhaled sharply, his face stiff, his pride clearly battling with the reality in front of him. Finally, he spoke. "Motion granted." A gasp rippled through the room. The prosecutor's mouth parted slightly like he wanted to object, but he didn't. Because he couldn't. Isaiah's client turned to him, his tired eyes widening in disbelief. The weight of months, years of injustice lifted from his shoulders in an instant. And Isaiah? He didn't gloat, he didn't smirk. He simply nodded, because this wasn't about ego. This was about justice, and today, justice had won. The gavel came down, echoing through the courtroom. Motion granted. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For Isaiah's client, it meant freedom. A chance to walk out of this courtroom as a man, not a statistic. But for the judge, it meant something far worse. It meant he had lost. He could feel the weight of the stares pressing in on him from all sides. The jurors, the court clerks, the spectators in the gallery, they had all witnessed it. A young black teenager, the very person he had mocked and humiliated, had just outmaneuvered him in his own courtroom. His fingers curled into fists, rage bubbling beneath his skin. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had spent decades commanding this room, controlling every case that came through these doors. Men like Isaiah weren't supposed to win here. And yet, he had. Isaiah didn't celebrate. He didn't smirk, didn't throw a single word of arrogance back in the judge's face. He didn't need to, because the judge could feel it. Respect, not forced, not demanded, but earned, and not just from the people watching, but from the very system that had tried to dismiss him. The judge let out a slow breath, forcing his expression into something neutral. Court is adjourned. The moment he stood to leave, the room exploded into murmurs. Isaiah turned to his client, shaking his hand firmly. "You're free to go," he said with a small nod. His client's hands trembled. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Just a deep, shaky breath as his eyes welled up. For the first time in years, he had hope. Isaiah gathered his papers, his movements calm, but inside, he knew this was bigger than just one case. Because this wasn't just a win. This was a warning to every judge, every prosecutor, every person who believed they could keep men like him, men like his client, powerless. The system wasn't untouchable anymore. And Isaiah Williams, he had just proved it. Isaiah walked out of the courtroom with his head held high. The whispers followed him, but they weren't the same as before. They weren't mocking, they weren't dismissive. They were filled with shock, respect, fear. He had unchallenged the system, and won. His client walked beside him, silent at first. But just before reaching the courthouse doors, he stopped. Isaiah turned, watching as the man rubbed his face, exhaling shakily. "I don't even know what to say." His voice cracked. "No one's ever fought for me like that before." Isaiah smiled, his voice steady. "They will now, because that's what this case had done." It had opened a door that could never be shut again. Isaiah had entered that courtroom as an anomaly, a black teenager standing where no one expected him to be. But now he was proof proof that the system wasn't untouchable, proof that power belonged to those who had the courage to take it. And as he stepped outside into the sunlight, he knew this was just the beginning. The sun hung high above the courthouse steps as Isaiah stood there, taking in a deep breath of crisp air. Freedom, not just for his client, but for himself. Because today, he hadn't just won a case. He had made history. His client stood beside him, still shaking his head in disbelief. "I thought I was done for," he muttered, voice thick with emotion. "They had already decided my fate before I even got to speak." Isaiah turned to him, his expression firm. "Not anymore." Because that was the truth. This wasn't just a win. This was a shift, a crack in the foundation of a system that had buried too many black men before they ever had a chance to fight. And now, the world had seen what was possible. The courtroom doors swung open behind him, and a group of reporters rushed forward. Cameras flashed, microphones were shoved toward him, voices overlapping with urgency. "Isaiah Williams, youngest attorney in history. What does this victory mean for you? How did it feel standing up to a judge like that? Do you think this case will change how young black lawyers are seen in court?" Isaiah took a slow breath, steadying himself. He had never cared about fame. This wasn't about going viral, about headlines, about cameras. This was about justice. So he lifted his chin, met their gazes, and spoke with the same quiet, unshakable power he had shown in that courtroom. "This isn't just my victory." He glanced at his client, then at the courthouse behind him. "This is a victory for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong, for every young black kid who's been underestimated before they even had a chance to prove themselves. The system wasn't built for us, but that doesn't mean we can't change it." The reporters scribbled furiously. The cameras clicked, but Isaiah wasn't thinking about them. He was thinking about the next case, the next battle, the next injustice that needed to be undone. Because this wasn't the end of his story. This was just the beginning of a legacy.